I have followed some of your work on social media, as I've already said before, and I like what I see because I've seen online you work on some of the petitions that you were forwarding on some of the groups about the blackface in Prague, stopping blackface in the annual Three Kings Day parade, as well as the justice for the Roma man who was killed in police custody, amongst a lot of things that you do. It's very inspiring. But I will let you introduce yourself. So please tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're from and how you ended up in Prague.
Hi, so I'm an American. I come originally from Miami. I am of Puerto Rican ethnicity, and I've been living in the Czech Republic for 3.5 years now, but I've lived in a few other countries prior to that, so I feel like I have a pretty diverse understanding of how expats get treated in different places.
Yeah.
I think having lived in Canada, the UK, and Vietnam, the Czech Republic is the place where I have been made to feel the most different.
I can relate. Yeah.
And so it led me to exploring these issues even more.
Yeah.
Because I felt like there weren't many voices talking about it here.
That is true. I can actually relate on that because I lived in a culture which I thought was so different from mine. I come from Swaziland in Africa, and I moved to Taiwan. I was living there for quite a long time. When I moved there, I thought that is the huge culture difference that I would get, but amazingly, I get a huge culture shock in Czech Republic, and I'm having a hard time to adapt, but it was so easier in Taiwan.
Yes, I found it easier in Vietnam, for sure.
Yeah. So I think the first and foremost culture shock that a lot of people experience when they moved here is the language barrier, which we should not, it is not a secret that a lot of Czech, a vast majority of Czech nationals speak the Czech language. Especially the older people, they don't know a lot of English even outside of Prague. So it's like, as a foreigner, I mean, I do understand that you have to know a little bit of Czech, like Czech phrases to get you by, like thank you, I want this and stuff like that. But it comes a point where it gets a bit complicated, and I feel a little bit discriminating towards foreigners when they are refused basic necessities or health or stuff like that based on the fact that they could not speak Czech.
I would absolutely agree. I have attempted to learn a bit of Czech. I'm only A1 at this point. I'm hoping to get to A2 within the next year. And so I do have respect for the culture, respect for the language. I do make an effort. However, I feel that there are points when people are vulnerable in ways that require them to be able to express themselves in a more internationally recognized language, such as English. Whether they're at the hospital or dealing with police, any sort of emergency situation or any sort of legal situation, there should be that support. At this point, 6% of the people living in the Czech Republic are foreigners.
Yeah.
And so it surprises me that these accommodations don't already exist.
Yeah, it's quite hard because imagine you find yourself in a situation where you have to report a crime or you've been violated in some way, and all the police officers are shunning you because they don't want to speak English, and it becomes an issue. I've had a lot of women being discriminated in hospitals because they couldn't speak English. I mean, think of it, most of I think like 50% or even more of the posts in expat groups are always about, I need a recommendation of an English-speaking doctor and a recommendation of an English-speaking gynecologist, and it's just sad to watch.
It really is. I've experienced it myself firsthand. I remember, I think it was the second day that I had arrived here. Some drunk man who lived in the apartment next door to like my Airbnb got his apartments confused and was trying to get into the apartment where I was in. And I didn't know what was happening. I just panicked and thought there's this man trying to get into my apartment.
Yeah.
So I called the police. And I mean, mind you, I'd been in the Czech Republic for 2 days. I knew Dobrý den, that's it.
Yeah.
And they hung up on me. And
are you serious?
Yeah. And I remember thinking, like, did I make a mistake? Like, I don't think this would happen somewhere else. And now I know that, there's a difference between calling 151, which is the local, like, Czech police, and 112, which will connect you through European services to someone who can speak English in an emergency. But I didn't know that then. I Googled the police number. It was 151. I called it. And, lucky for me, the man figured out his mistake and went on his way. I called the landlord and we cleared it up. But it was the first time I realized, like, how vulnerable we really are as foreigners here.
Wow, that is scary. I had that fear when I was heavily pregnant, and my husband at that time, he used to go to work every morning, and it's the two of us. So I always thought, what if I go into labor right now? Like, if, I don't know, like in TV, they dramatize the whole thing, like, oh, my water broke, now you rush to the hospital. But now I know it doesn't work like that, when you're giving birth. But I was having that fear that if that happens, who's going to rush me to the hospital? Because I'm going to call the ambulance and they'll be like, oh, you speak English, hang up. So it's quite scary.
Yeah, I'm actually really curious about what your experience was having a pregnancy in the Czech Republic, because I think it is something a lot of women wonder about, with that language barrier. Is it difficult?
It really is. I think the hardest part is finding the English-speaking doctor, as we talked about, an English-speaking gynecologist for that matter. And when I got here, I was already pregnant and I had to find a gynecologist quite quickly. Mm-hmm. So we found one, I think in Prague one, this woman, she's really, really older, like the generation that is not really welcoming to foreigners, and she spoke English, but she was not a nice lady, I would put it that way. And so it was like that, but I wouldn't know a lot because I was already 7 months pregnant when I came here. So that's that.
Wow.
Yeah, and so I wanted to talk about this issue of gynecologists always requesting additional fees to speak English, because it's an issue that has been happening here, and I don't know if people are talking about it to the right channels. You know what I mean?
I was under the impression that it was a discriminatory practice, but it is actually legal for the gynecologist.
It's legal
to charge extra fees for speaking English.
It's legal.
Yeah, it's a legal practice, and that's really alarming to me. I think when it comes to healthcare in general, there is not a lot of support that foreigners get from, be it the Czech government in making sure that discrimination doesn't happen. When I compare it to even Vietnam, which people would argue is a less developed country comparatively, in Vietnam, because I had the health insurance, the hospital provided a free translator for me. So I never really faced these kinds of issues, whereas here, not only is it perfectly legal for a doctor to charge you an extra fee for speaking English, but it is also mandated that third country nationals are on a private health insurance that gives you far less coverage than the national health insurance that Czech people have access to does.
You never feel like one of them, ever. When you're a foreigner, and I can attest to that, because also in Taiwan, everyone is on the same health insurance, whether you're a foreigner or a local, it's the same health insurance. And you're talking about having a translator and stuff like that. In Taiwan, they don't learn English at school. You have to go to after school English school if your parents can afford it, but you never find yourself in a position where you cannot find help because they don't speak English. They're even willing to go to Google Translate, or if there is no one who speaks English in the hospital, they will try and find them for you. They will be looking around, or they will know a guy who speaks English and they will bring them to you. They never go to a point where they say, oh, we don't speak English, I'm sorry, go find someone who speaks English.
I've had nurses at hospitals tell me, this is the Czech Republic, you should speak Czech, in Czech. And, again, like if it's something at a restaurant or some sort of casual situation, I think I can forgive it. But when I've been sick and I've been like waiting in an emergency room, that's the last thing you want to hear. I think that I wouldn't be able to have accessed as much of even like the day-to-day care, you know, for like medications I'm prescribed and these sorts of things, if it wasn't for the help of my Czech friends and my Czech partner. And it's a little bit sad because I'm grateful to them, but at the same time, I don't want to feel dependent on anybody else. You know, it creates a sort of imbalance. Particularly with my partner, in some cases where I have to say, okay, I need you to call this doctor because the doctor speaks English, but the reception doesn't. Once I was calling a specialist in order to get an appointment. I think for a year I tried, like emails, phone calls, and after a year of trying, my partner called once in Czech and I had an appointment.
I know what you're talking about, this dependence on your Czech partner, because it's not just like doctors or anything, it's basically everywhere. Even when you are looking for an apartment, it's easier when you have your Czech partner do it than you do it, because then, you know, they don't like renting to foreigners or they will not respond or stuff like that. So I can totally understand that. And the point of you being not attended to in hospitals because you're a foreigner, you speak English. I just saw a post from another lady in the expat group talking about how she went to Motol as an emergency, and she was in real pain and no one could attend her in the emergency room because no one speaks English around, and they told her to go find a hospital where they can speak English. And now imagine being in that situation. It's really not a nice thing. It's really not.
Motol is the biggest hospital in Prague. Like, Motol is the place where technically she would have had the best chance of finding someone English speaking.
Yeah, it's hard. I'm gonna read this extract from one of the groups. Like, this lady says, she requested to I was requested to pay additional fees after my consultation. I was about to pay when I remembered I'm fully covered by insurance and whatnot. So I asked what this fee was for. With an angry and condescending tone, I got this beautiful answer: no one is paying me to speak English with you. If you don't want to pay for the additional fees, I will not communicate your results per mail, and you'll have to come back with an interpreter or someone that speaks Czech. So yeah, that's really hard to find yourself in such a situation.
It really is a shame. Personally, I would love to see, and I think we're a long way from this, but I would love to see a sense of solidarity even outside social media for Czech expats, because we do have like the Expat and Women in Prague group where we can all kind of confide in each other and feel supported when we experience these things. But when I think of the fact that more than 6% of the people living in this country are foreigners, I wonder why we don't lobby, why we don't petition, why we don't ask the government to take us into consideration. Because we work here, we pay taxes here. You know, it's not like we're not contributing to the society. It's not like most of the people I know are trying to learn a bit of Czech. I think that it would benefit the Czech Republic, especially since they are dependent on workers and students coming from the outside world, to try and accommodate our needs a little bit more.
Yeah, I get that point. Actually, I was going to talk about it later. There's these issues where foreigners are verbally abused in public spaces for speaking English on the phone or speaking English with your friends in the tram, and you're speaking out loud and people just don't feel okay hearing you speak English in their country. Like this instance, this lady wrote that there was a woman on the tram and she was speaking on the phone, unaware of the insults that the Czech man was saying to her, and everyone heard in the tram. Obviously they speak Czech. Basically he was using phrases like, "Oh, get out of our country, why are you speaking English in my country, you cow," and stuff like that. and he was saying it loudly in the face of everyone, and instead of people speaking up to him to stop those verbal insults, they were agreeing with him and nodding their heads. Well, not agreeing verbally, but nodding their heads, just shrugging it off and stuff like that. And it's really not nice, being called that, especially if you don't understand the language, you don't know what the person is saying to you. And to me, that's one of my biggest fears all in Czech, that people will be calling things to me and I don't even understand what they're saying. One time I was walking down the street. I think I was pregnant at the time, and these guys they opened the window and they shouted something in their car passing. So I don't know what they were saying. I don't know if it was an insult or catcalling, or I don't know what to name it, but it made me feel really small.
I'm really sorry to hear that. And to be honest, I have so many friends who have had experiences of just hostility, and it's not every day, but they make memories. These instances, they stay with you, and it makes you a little bit more nervous when you go out to think that people don't want me here. And how do I know that today is going to be a normal day, or a day where someone just yells something at me? Or is that person staring at me because they're curious, or is it because they're angry? And it really colors your whole perception of living here. And it just, when I think about that, it makes me sad. I do feel like things are changing because I see more and more diversity in the center of Prague. The more people that I see of different nationalities, the more hope I have that it'll become normal to see someone speaking a different language, and people will learn to accept that over time.
Mm-hmm.
I think another issue that comes up a lot is that when I've tried to express this kind of anxiety of feeling like I don't belong, because I've also had experiences where people have yelled things at me, and I've been followed around stores and accused of stealing a couple of times. And
yeah, I wanted to ask you about how it's like for you being a person of color in Prague. How has the experience been like?
I think it's different than it would have been if I had a white skin tone, for sure.
Obviously.
I have sat with Americans who are blonde and blue-eyed and have been like, people here are really nice, I found the experience was so friendly. And I thought, were they on another planet? I didn't know. I was very surprised, because people will say, oh, it's only the language barrier, but I don't think that's true.
That, yeah.
It goes beyond that. And yeah, I have been followed around stores and accused of stealing a couple of times, which I never have, so fine. If you want to search me. But, I'm curious, why me? Why stop me? Or, for example, I've had people make monkey noises,
Oh, wow.
And I remember just being, completely shocked that people still do this, So, and whenever, I guess what I'm trying to say is, whenever I have mentioned this, people have, Czech people mostly, have said to me, oh, well, that's terrible, but that's just one person. It's not a social problem. It's just individual racists or xenophobes.
No, I'm so glad you touched on that, because I wanted us to get there, where everything that you go through, people, your feelings, they try to make it seem as nothing here.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's not just you. Or I should be okay. Oh, I was harassed, they touched my boobs, or at least they didn't rape you. They always try to make it sound so small, and you shouldn't be feeling that way. But your feelings are valid, and no one should ever tell you how to feel.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder how much of that is cultural. I wonder if, generally speaking, Czech people are repressing themselves, and therefore they expect you to repress your feelings as well.
I would say this brings us to the topic of the C word, because I tend to hear that a lot. Every time Czech people do something, they excuse their behavior based on communism, and they'll be like, "Oh, it's because of communism." They don't. Why don't you speak up about this? Oh, it's because of communism. The poor customer service. Oh, it's the communism mentality. This and this, and I am really, really tired of hearing every excuse going back there. I am not making it sound like it wasn't a thing, and there's a difference between the two. I understand that they went through communism for like 30 years, 33 years, and I understand that, of course, it shaped some of their traditions and practices somewhere, somehow. But at some point, you have to take accountability of what you're doing as your own doing, and not because of communism, not because communism made you act in such an asshole manner that you're doing.
I think historical trauma is important to acknowledge, but you're right, it doesn't excuse behavior, much like just because someone was abused as a child doesn't make it acceptable for them to abuse their own children.
Exactly.
At some point, you have to heal from what happened, not only as an individual, but as a culture.
Yeah.
And I am sympathetic to an extent, but I do agree, mostly because I've traveled to other ex-communist countries and I've had better experiences. I've traveled through the Balkans and I didn't expect to feel as welcomed as I did. Even in places that were not so touristy, people were kind, people were curious. And I think that, when you look at like statistics that measure European kind of stances towards immigration, you'll find that the Czech Republic has not the harshest stance in the EU, but one of the harsher stances. And that's not true for every ex-communist country that happens to be part of the EU now. So there has to be more at play there.
Yeah.